recent online event Executed Queens, Diane, one of the participants, shared with us some passages from a book published in 1925. The book was called Mortems of Mere Mortals, Essays Historical and Medical, and it was written by Charles Maclaurin. Maclaren, who was born in 1872, was an Australian medical practitioner who served in the Australian Commonwealth military forces. He was clearly interested in historical figures, for his book comprised essays on people such as Joan of Arc, Charles V, Napoleon, the Tudor monarchs, Ivan the Terrible, and James I, Charles I, and Charles II. And it also contained an essay on Anne Boleyn. Now, Maclaurin prefaces his work by saying that being in Australia, he had no access to the original sources, so had to rely on the printed word. In his essay on Anne, he mentions earlier historians such as Froude, who he calls out of date, and states that his work is marred by his hero worship of Henry and his strong Protestant bias. A.F. Pollard, whose work is described as meticulously accurate and charmingly written, and S.R. Gardner, whose view that the charges against Anne are too horrible to believe and that her only offence was failing to give the king a son, is dismissed by Maclaurin, as he, and I quote, had evidently seen little of psychological medicine, or he would have known that no charge is too horrible to believe. Maclaurin also mentions letters and papers, the Spanish Chronicle, and Lord Herbert of Cherbury, so he had done some digging, but wow, his ideas are rather weird and unpalatable for a 21st century audience. Now, I've just been reading Bonnie Garmus's Lessons in Chemistry, which is set in the US in the 1950s and 60s, so at least I was used to being horrified about how women were viewed in this era, and obviously the 1920s would have been worse. But I really didn't know whether to laugh or cry reading Maclaurin's essay on Anne Boleyn. You can read the work for yourself on archive.org. It's available as a digitised version to borrow. But here are some highlights, or perhaps I mean lowlights. Oh, and before I start, amusingly in his introduction to his essay on the case of Anne Boleyn, Maclaurin writes of the rubbish taught in schools. He then goes on to spout his own rubbish. He states that it is impossible to doubt that Henry VIII contracted syphilis in his youth because it was so prevalent at the time, and he blames Catherine and Anne's miscarriages on this. Of Anne Boleyn's long hair, he writes, "Her hair was long, and it appears that she used to wear it long and flowing in the house. It was not so very long since Joan of Arc had been burnt largely because she went about without a wimple. And Mistress Anne's conduct with regard to her hair was probably worse in those days than for a girl to be seen smoking cigarettes when driving a motor car today." Shocking. He states that Anne was the great passion of Henry's life, and that had she behaved herself, she might have retained that love. Unfortunately, she repulsed him for several years, and we can see the idea of divorce gradually growing in his mind. He writes that it is doubtful whether Anne Boleyn was ever anything more than an ambitious courtesan, and it's doubtful whether she ever felt anything towards him but her natural wish to be queen. Obviously, he's not an Anne fan. But then it gets worse, far worse. Maclaurin describes how Anne, less than a month after Elizabeth was born, while she was still in the puerperal state, seduced Henry Norris, her husband's most intimate friend, and that during the next couple of years, Anne seems to have gone absolutely out of her senses. If the contemporary stories are true, she seems to have solicited several prominent men of the court and even to have stooped to one of the musicians. Worst of all, it was said that she committed incest with her brother, Lord Rochford. While Maclaurin dismisses the incest charge, he very much believes the other charges, writing of how, before she became a queen, Henry was probably complacent enough to Anne's peccadilloes. But afterwards, that was altogether different. Maclaurin then gives himself some credibility, explaining that he is speaking as a doctor with very little religious preference one way or the other, before concluding that Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, both exceedingly able men, would not gratuitously raise the question of incest and promiscuity and send 4 innocent men to their deaths without good reason, and that stern as they were, they never showed any sign of mere bloodlust at any other time. But why would Anne behave so badly as a queen? Well, here's where Maclaurin's views get truly bizarre, but I guess they were of his time. He writes, "We can thoroughly explain her conduct by supposing that she was afflicted by hysteria and nymphomania. There is plenty of indubitable evidence that she was hysterical and unbalanced, and that she passionately longed for a son, and it's simpler to believe her the victim of a well-known and common disease than that we should suppose the leading statesman of England and nearly the whole of its peerage suddenly to be affected with bloodlust." Yes, rather than question whether a queen who is pretty much confined to her chambers before being churched could actually commit adultery at this time, he goes with nymphomania. As historian Eric Ives pointed out, 3/4 of the dates cited in the indictments listing the alleged offences did not make sense. But I guess Eric Ives didn't take into account nymphomania, or perhaps Anne being able to travel by broomstick or magic carpet to palaces that she wasn't actually at. Maclaurin goes on, "Her spasms of violent temper after her marriage, her fits of jealousy, her foolish arrogance and insolence to her friends are all mental signs which go with nymphomania, and the fact that her post-nuptial incontinence seems to have begun while she was still in the puerperal state after the birth of her own living child seems highly significant. It is not uncommon for sexual desire to become intolerable in nervous and puerperal women. The proper place for Anne Boleyn was a mental hospital." Oh boy, I don't know quite what to say to that. I think I just need to keep telling myself that this book was published 99 years ago. Wow. Meanwhile, Henry VIII is given a bit of a free pass for his behaviour. Maclaurin writes, "On the whole, one cannot avoid the conclusion that his conduct to his wives was not all his fault. They seem to have done no credit to his power of selection. The first and the last appear to have been the best, considered as women." I can't quite bring myself to read the other chapters. I'll need to build up to that. I do wonder what he makes of Joan of Arc. Now, this video was a bit of a laugh, really. I just couldn't get past, well, the views of this man. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and, yes, whether you think there's any credit in it at all. But yes, 1925 view of Anne Boleyn is rather strange, isn't it? I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.